My name is Rui Tavares. I am a Portuguese historian who specializes on 18th century history, namely history of ideas. I have studied censorship in the 18th century. I have studied the links between censorship and enlightenment, and discovered that part of the cognitive structure of Enlightenment philosophy was not so different from what the censors were after, a way of ascertaining true from false and rejecting everything that was false and focusing on what was true. So the main discovery of this study of 18th century censorship was that pluralism that we usually ascribe to Enlightenment had a longer and more arduous birth and evolution than what we usually think. Then after I was surprisingly elected to the European Parliament, and while I served for a mandate there between 2009 and 2014, I was rapporteur for the Parliament in two different portfolios. Being a rapporteur for the European Parliament, meaning being the responsible politician for files of political importance or even legislative files in the European Union. So one of the files was resettlement of refugees, and the other file was the situation of fundamental rights and rule of law in Hungary. Apparently they are disconnected, but they have a lot to do, because of course recognizing rights of your own citizens and upholding the values of democracy, pluralism and the rule of law goes hand in hand also with the way that you treat foreigners, refugees, asylum seekers, exiles and migrants. Sometimes governments will try to convince you that that's not true. Sometimes they will try to convince you that they are not being hospitable to foreigners because they want to focus on treating very well their nationals. But historically, usually, you see that the kind of political authority tools that they amass, that they collect, that they centralized in order to close their borders and shut the foreigners out, are then used for the peoples that remain in, meaning for the nationals. So usually there's a pretty good correlation between a country being hospitable to foreigners, recognizing that the right to asylum is a universal right, and also recognizing the civic, political, social and cultural rights of their citizens. So this experience in the European Parliament, at the same time trying to convince the European governments to accept that the resettlement of refugees was something that had been done in the past, that had been successful in the past, and that we should repeat in order to not let countries destabilize around Europe. And at the same time working on Hungary, which had been a country that had generated refugees, that had been the beneficiaries in a very terrible situation, but the beneficiaries of the resettlement consensus that we had in the past and that we are losing now, was a very formative experience. So what am I doing now? I am trying to combine these two experiences. I am trying to combine my first education as an historian of the 18th century, specializing on art history, on history of literature and history of ideas, with the current crisis in Europe that I have seen as a political practitioner, if you will. I've come up with an idea. It's an idea that comes from the 18th century, the idea of Candide, who's this character of Voltaire's famous book about a young man that goes around the world and every kind of tragedy and catastrophe happens to him, and he has a philosopher professor by his side that tells him, don't worry, everything is going up according to the best of possibilities in the best of possible worlds. Candide has something to do with my city, with my home city, Lisbon, because in the beginning of the book he goes to Lisbon and he suffers the terrible Lisbon earthquake of 1755. And then, of course, the European Union now lives under the jurisdiction of a treaty which is called the Treaty of Lisbon, also named after my hometown. Someone who is very skeptical of the idea of the European project, so someone very unlike me, would say that coming from the earthquake of Lisbon to the Treaty of Lisbon is like coming from one catastrophe to the other. Being an optimistic myself, I do not exactly believe that. I think that there is scope for human progress, but I am trying to find this meaning, trying to search the meaning of human progress in the long-winded and sometimes quite terrible history of European crises, catastrophes, tragedies, and wars. Trying to combine the worst of possible worlds, I would say, into some meaning that we can use today to build the best of possible futures.